21. The king was fed up with the silence, so he ordered his commanders to be on alert. At dawn on the second day, the army marched in large numbers, and the fleet took off, reaching Ptolemy in 2 days. No trace of the enemy appeared around it, so the vanguards entered it in peace, and the army followed suit. The vanguards penetrated north to Panopolis, the last country in the north of Thebes, and entered it without resistance. The news reached King Ahmose that Panopolis was in Egyptian hands. Ahmose shouted, "The shepherds have been evacuated from the kingdom of Thebes." Ha said, "They will be expelled from Egypt soon." The army advanced towards Panopolis and entered it, proud and victorious, to the tunes of enthusiastic music. The trumpets were blown to announce victory. Egyptian flags were raised on the city wall. The soldiers spread out in the markets and mixed with the people, chanting and chanting. The city was filled with insane joy that throbbed in every chest and resonated with every breath. The king became accustomed to a pimp. The army, the fleet, and the court were a sumptuous feast, at the end of which cups filled with vintage Mariat wines were served, along with lotus flowers and basil stems. The king said to his men, "Tomorrow we will cross the borders of the northern kingdom, and the flags of Egypt will be raised on its walls for the first time in over 100 years. The men called for him and chanted his name for a long time. But in the afternoon of that day, the guards saw a constellation of wheels running towards the city from the north, raising a white flag. The soldiers surrounded it and asked about its purpose. One of its men said that they had been sent by King Ahmose to Ahmose, so the soldiers proceeded with them to the city, and Ahmose learned about the messenger's order, so he went to the palace of the governor. The city, and he called to him the commander of the fleet, and the 2 commanders, Naguib and Dib, and he sat on the ruler's chair, surrounded by his commanders and around them the guards in their luxurious clothes, and he allowed the messengers to enter, and the Egyptians did not know what the messengers were carrying this time. So they waited in anticipation, and the messengers of the king of the shepherds came, and they were a mixture of the commanders and the chamberlains. They were dressed in military and civilian clothes, preceded by their long beards. Their faces did not show any challenge or harshness as Ahmose expected, but they approached the king's council and they all bowed in reverence and respect until the king almost declared his astonishment. The eldest of them said, "May God bless you, O king of Thebes. We are the messengers of the Pharaoh of Egypt. Lower and middle to you." Ahmose gave them a look that did not indicate anything that was agitating within him, and said calmly, "God bless you, O messengers of Apophis. What do you want?" The messengers seemed dissatisfied with the king's neglect of their king's titles, but their leader said, "O king, we are men of war, in whose field we grew up and in whose tradition we live. We are brave and valiant as you have afflicted us. We admire the hero even if he is our enemy, and we submit to the rule of the sword even if it is against us, and you have been victorious, O king. You regained the throne of your kingdom, so you have the right to own it, just as we have the right to hand it over, for it is your kingdom and you are its king. Pharaoh extends his greetings to you, and offers you an end to bloodshed and an honorable reconciliation that respects rights and reconciles the broken ties of affection between the kingdom of the south and the kingdom of the north." The king listened to the messengers with apparent calm and hidden astonishment, then he looked at the people's language and asked him in astonishment, "Have you really come to seek peace?" The man said, "Yes, O king." Ahmose said in a voice indicating determination and firmness, "I reject this greeting. Why do you insist on war, O king?" Ahmose said, "O people of Apophis, for the first time you have addressed an Egyptian with respect, and for the first time you have desisted from describing him as a slave. Do you know why? Because you have been defeated. You are ferocious beasts if you are defeated, and willing if you are defeated. Do you ask me why I insist on war? So here is my answer. I did not announce it to you to restore Thebes, but I pledged to my Lord and my people that I would liberate all of Egypt from the yoke of injustice and tyranny, and that I would restore its freedom and glory. If the one who sent you truly wants peace, then let him leave Egypt to its people and return with his people to the deserts of the north." The messenger asked him in a thick voice, "Is this the last word?" Ahmose said with confidence and strength, "It is what we began the struggle with, and the last thing with which we will conclude it." So the messengers stood up, and their leader said, "As long as you want war, it will be a fierce war between us and you until the Lord decides it according to his will." The men bowed to the king again and left the place with heavy steps. 22. Ahmose stayed in Panopolis for 2 full days, then sent vanguards to penetrate the borders of the state of Abu-Fais. Strong groups advanced north of the city and clashed with small enemy forces, tearing them apart and paving the way for the army camped in Panopolis. Ahmose marched at the head of an army the size of which Egypt had never seen before. Or his numbers, and the mighty fleet of Ahmose our father took off with its victorious ships, and on the way to advance, the eyes informed the king that the army of shepherds was camped in the south of Aphroditopolis in countless numbers. The king did not care about the number of shepherds, but he asked the chamberlain saying, "I wonder if Apophis still has a force from the wheels that throws us." said, "There is no doubt, my lord, that Apophis has lost the largest number of his knights, and if he had had a force of them capable of deciding this fight, he would not have asked for reconciliation or sought peace, although the shepherds have lost what is more valuable than knights and chariots: trust and hope." The army's advance continued until it approached its enemy's camp, and the harbingers of battle appeared on the horizon, and the chariot squad prepared to go into battle under the leadership of the king, and Ahmose shouted to the commander, saying, "We will fight on a land that has been forbidden to us for more than 100 years. Let us strike a massive blow that will put an end to the pain of millions of our enslaved brothers, and let us advance with hearts of great courage, for the Lord has endowed us with numbers and hope, and has failed our enemy with extinction and despair, and I am at your head, as Siknan-Ra was, and as Ahmose was." The king ordered his vanguards to attack. They swooped like sweeping eagles, and he was motivated to attack while watching them to see how the enemy would meet them. He saw a force of chariots estimated at 200 chariots responding to the attack, trying to catch them. The king had a strong desire to eliminate the enemy's chariots, so he attacked on top of the chariots and pounced on the enemy from all sides. The Hyksos realized that their knights could not prove themselves to forces many times superior to them. Apophis sent battalions of archers and spearmen to support his limited forces. A fierce battle took place, but the shepherds' courage was of no use to them, and their mounted force was destroyed. And the army spent the night, and Ahmose did not know whether Apophis would meet him with his infantry in despair or flee with his army, preferring safety, as he did in Hierakonpolis. The matter became clear in the morning when the king saw the crowds of shepherds advancing to occupy their positions, bows and spears in their hands, and saw them and said, "Now the circle is turning on them, my lord. Apophis, with his infantry, attacks our chariots, just as our king Sychanera did in the south of Kaptos 10 years ago." So the king's chest was open, and he prepared to attack with a squad of chariots supported by selected forces of archers and other weapon squads. The chariots pounced on the shepherds' positions, filling the air in front of them with flying arrows. They pierced the ranks in many places, while the archers behind them protected their backs and pursued those who dispersed from the enemy, killing and capturing them. The shepherds fought according to what was known about them of courage, but they were falling dry leaves exposed to the strong autumn winds, and the Egyptians took control of the field, and Ahmose feared that Apophis would escape his hand, so he attacked Aphroditopolis, just as the fleet had attacked its shores, but he did not find a trace of shepherds within its walls. Nor did he stumble upon his archenemy. Then he was informed by the eyes that Apophis had left the city with forces from his army after the fall of the previous night, and that he had left what he had left of his men to hinder the advance of the Egyptians. And said to the king, "I will not. Resistance is futile after today, and perhaps Apophis will now seek refuge in Houaris to take refuge within its impregnable walls." Ahmose did not regret it for long, and his happiness in conquering a country in Egypt, which had been forbidden to his people for 200 years, was not equivalent to happiness, so he was busy checking on its conditions and its people about everything. 23. The army advanced in its great march, finding no resistance or trace of the enemy. The people of the villages and countries received it, astonished with joy, not believing that the gods had lifted their wrath after 2 centuries of humiliation. and that the one who conquered their countries and expelled their enemy from them was a king among them who would resurrect the glory of the pharaohs again. Ahmose found that the shepherds had fled the cities, leaving their palaces and villages, carrying as much of their possessions and money as they could carry. And it was heard everywhere he went that Apophis was diligent in escaping with his army and his people to the north, and thus he recovered the king in a month of time, Hepsel, Lycopolis, and Kosi, and then finally reached Hermopolis, and their entry into it had a great impact on the soul of Ahmose and his soldiers. Because Hermopolis is the birthplace of the Holy Mother Tutishuri, and her birth was before the era of occupation in her future home, so Ahmose celebrated her liberation, and the courtiers, the commanders of land and sea, and all the soldiers participated in the great celebration. Then the king wrote to his grandmother a letter congratulating her on the independence of her first homeland, Hermopolis, and included his emotions and the emotions of his soldiers and people, and the king, the commander, and the courtiers signed it, and senior officers. Then the army advanced in its victorious march. So he entered Tanui, Sinopolis, and Hebron, then Arsinoe, and descended between the pyramids on the road to Great Memphis, not caring about the hardships of travel and the length of the road. Meanwhile, Ahmose was breaking the shackles in which his miserable people were bound, and breathing new life into them from his great spirit, until one day Ha said to him, "Your greatness, war, my lord, is unparalleled by anything in existence except your political ability and your administrative skill. You have changed the features of countries, erasing regimes and establishing regimes, delineating the paths that should be followed and the laws that should be followed, and appointing national rulers, so life sprung again in the veins of the valley, and people saw for the first time since there was a bygone era of Egyptian rulers and Egyptian judges, so bowed heads rose, and the man was no longer ashamed of his tan and was reproached for it, but rather it became his habitat and his pride. May the Lord Amun protect you, O grandson of Siknir." The king was a sincere and striving worker who knew neither despair nor fatigue. His unwavering goal was to restore pride, satiety, prosperity, and knowledge to his people, who had been crushed by humiliation, hunger, poverty, and ignorance. However, his heart did not survive his toil and preoccupation with his own concerns, so passion consumed him and pride consumed him. He would often hit the ground with his foot and say to himself, "I have been deceived, and she is nothing but a woman without a heart." He hoped that work would fill him with forgetfulness and solace, but he found his spirit flows despite himself to the ship that is being tossed by the waves at the back of his fleet. 24. He expelled the advance of the army and proceeded to approach eternal Memphis with glorious memories, and its towering white walls began to appear to him. Ahmose thought that the shepherds would defend their king's capital in a desperate defense. But he made a mistake and his vanguards entered the city in peace. He learned that Apophis was retreating with his army towards the northeast. Ahmose entered Thebes of the north in a ceremony the likes of which he had never witnessed before. The people received him with an enthusiastic and solemn welcome, prostrated before him and called him Ibn Munfta. The king stayed in Memphis for several days, visiting its lands, seeing its markets and industrial neighborhoods, touring the 3 pyramids, praying in the temple of the Sphinx, and offering sacrifices. There was no joy equivalent to their joy in the conquest of Memphis except the recovery of Thebes, and Ahmose was amazed at how the shepherds did not defend Memphis, so the leader Moheb said to him, "They will not voluntarily expose themselves to the might of our chariots after they destroyed them in Hierakonpolis and Aphroditopolis." The chamberlain, Aur, said confidently, "Ships keep coming to us, loaded with chariots and horses, from the southern provinces, and Apophis has no choice but to take care of the walls of Houaris." They all consulted about the direction they would turn to after the invasion spread before them, and Commander Deeb said, "There is no doubt that the enemy has fled the entire north and is confined to the east behind the walls of Houars, so we must go to him with our full forces." However, Ahmose was very careful. He sent a small army to the west via Linopolis, and another marched north in the direction of Thebes, and marched with his main forces and his great fleet eastward on the road to On. Radi Immortal, then Phakosa, then Farbites, and they set off on the road leading to Houris. News of Apophis was spreading to them, and they learned that shepherds had fled from all sides to Hyksos, driving thousands of wretched people. This news caused great sadness in the king's soul, and it softened the condition of those humiliated captives who had fallen into captivity. The cruel grip of shepherds. Finally, the enormous walls of Hyksos appeared on the horizon like rocky mountains, and Ahmose shouted, "This is the last fortress of shepherds in Egypt." Ha said to him while looking at the fort with his weak eyes, "Destroy its doors, my lord, and the beautiful face of Egypt will be saved for you." 25. Hyksos was located east of the branch of the Nile, and its wall extended eastward for a distance without sight. Many of the people knew the fortified city, and some of them worked inside it or on its walls. They said to their king, "The city is surrounded by 4 huge, thick, circular walls, followed by a surrounding moat through which the Nile water flows. The city has vast fields that suffice the needs of all its people, and most of them are soldiers except the Egyptian farmers. The city is irrigated by streams taken from the branches of the Nile under the western wall and under its protection, and heading east towards the city." Ahmose and his men stood south of the enormous fortress, looking at their faces in bewilderment at the great, sprawling walls. The soldiers at their peaks looked like dwarfs. The army struck its tents, and the ranks of the soldiers extended along the southern wall. The fleet advanced in the river west of the western wall, out of range of its arrows, to monitor and besiege. Ahmose was listening to what the people said about the fort, and he examined the land surrounding it and the river flowing to its west while his mind did not stop thinking. Meanwhile, he led mounted and infantry forces to the villages surrounding the city, and they captured them without difficulty, and his siege of the fort became complete in a short time. But he and his men knew that the siege was futile, that the city was independent of everything else, and that if the siege extended for years, it would have no effect on it. He and his army will continue to suffer from boredom and hopeless waiting, and the horrors and fluctuations of the weather. While he was walking around the fort, a thought occurred to him, so he called his men to his tent to consult with them about the matter, and he said to them, "Advise me, for I see the siege as a waste of life and a waste of strength, and I see the attack as a kind of futility. An outright suicide, and perhaps the enemy hopes that we will attack him to hunt down our brave men or trap them in his trenches. So what is the opinion?" Commander Thebes said, "The opinion, my lord, is that we besiege the fort with part of our forces, and consider the war over at that point. Then you declare the independence of the valley and begin your duty as Pharaoh of United Egypt." But Ha objected to the idea, saying, "How do you leave Apophis safe, training his men and renewing his will so that he can attack us later?" Commander Moheb said enthusiastically, "We have paid the price of Thebes dearly, and the struggle is sacrifice and sacrifice, so why do we not pay the price of Hyksos and attack as we attack the fortresses of Thebes?" Commander Thebes said, "We do not think highly of ourselves, but attacking 4 huge walls separated by trenches filled with water will destroy our soldiers without cost." The king was silent and contemplating, and he said, pointing to the river flowing under the western wall of the city, "Hyksos is strong and will not be taken. She will not go hungry, but she may become thirsty." The men looked at the river with amazement on their faces, and Ah said in astonishment, "How is Hyksos thirsty, my lord?" Ahmose said calmly, "By diverting the waters of the Nile from it." The men looked again at the Nile, unable to believe that this great river could be diverted from its course, and Ha wondered, "Is it possible to do this mighty work?" Ahmose said, "We do not lack engineers or workers. How much time does it take us, my lord? 1 year, 2 years, or 3 years? What does time matter as long as this is the only way? The Nile north of Pharbatus must be transformed into a new stream heading west towards Mendes, so that Apophis can choose between dying of hunger and thirst or going out to fight us. And my people will forgive me for having exposed the Egyptians in halls or exposed to danger and destruction, just as I was forgiven for having done so to some of the women of Thebes." 26. Ahmose prepared for the great work. He summoned the famous Theban engineers and presented his idea to them. They studied it with interest and passion. Then they told the king, his idea could be implemented on the condition that he give them time and provide them with thousands of workers. Ahmose knew that his project would not be realized before 2 years had passed, so he did not despair. But he sent messengers to the countries urging people to volunteer for the great work entrusted to liberate the homeland and expel its enemy by achieving it. And the workers came in groups from all over until a sufficient number of them gathered to begin the work. The king inaugurated the great project, so he grabbed an axe and hit it on the ground, announcing the beginning of the work, and the forearms followed him. The macho woman who works hard to sing chants and songs. The king and his army had no choice but to wait a long time, and the soldiers were doing their daily training under the supervision of the officers and commanders. As for the king, he used to fill his free time by going out to the eastern desert in search of hunting, and racing, and to escape from the desires of his heart and the whims of his whims. During this period of waiting, a messenger carried to him a message from his mother. Saint Totishuri said, "My lord, son of Amun, Pharaoh of Upper and Lower Egypt, may the Lord protect him and support him with victory and victory. Little Thebes today is a garden of happiness and joy thanks to what your messengers brought to it of the clear victory that the Lord has bestowed upon you, and our expectation today in Thebes is different from our expectation yesterday. Because it is fraught with consolation and closer to hope, and how happy we all are to know that Egypt has been liberated from humiliation and slavery, and that its enemy and humiliator has locked himself within the walls of his fortress, submissively waiting for the judgment that will be imposed on him. The Almighty God wanted them to love you, you who humbled his enemy and exalted his word, with his kindness and mercy, so he blessed you with a boy who will be a light for your eyes and an heir to your reign. I called him Amenhotep, out of blessing from the worshipped Lord. I received him with my own hands as I had received his father, his grandfather, and his paternal grandfather before, and my heart tells me that he will be the crown prince of a kingdom. Great, multi-ethnic, multilingual and multi-religious, cared for by his beloved father." Ahmose's heart beat with the beat of fatherhood, and his ribs were filled with compassion. He rejoiced with great joy, making him forget some of the pain of pent-up passion. His men announced the birth of his crown prince, Amenhotep, and it was a memorable day. 27. The days passed slowly and heavy, but full of great deeds that were accomplished by the greatest minds, the strongest arms, and the highest determinations. They all did not care about the hardship of work or the passage of time as long as it brought them closer to their highest hope and highest goal. But one day, and several months had passed since the siege had passed, the guards saw a cart coming towards the fort with a white flag waving on its front. Some of the guards received it and found 3 men from the guards inside it. So they asked them about their destination. The eldest of them said, "They are the messengers of King Ahmose to King Ahmose," and the guards relayed the news to the king. So the king held a council of his courtiers and his commanders in his pavilion, and ordered the messengers to be brought to him, and the men were brought, walking in humility, and their arrogance had gone from them, and they seemed as if they were not from the people of Ahmose. And they bowed down before the king, and their elder saluted him, saying, "May God bless you, O king." Ahmose replied to him, saying, "Greetings, O messengers of Ahmose. What does your king want?" The messenger said, "O king, the man of the sword is an adventurer who seeks victory, but death may overtake him. We are men of war, and war empowered us with your homeland, so we ruled it for 2 centuries or more in which we were the worshipped masters. Then we were doomed to defeat, so we were defeated and forced to hold on to our castle. We, O king, are strong men who are able to bear defeat just as we are able to reap the fruits of victory." Ahmose said angrily, "I see that you have realized what this new stream that my people are digging means, so you have come to ask for forgiveness." The man shook his huge head and said, "No, O king, we do not seek anyone's sympathy, but we acknowledge defeat, and my lord has sent me to offer you 2 things from which you can choose what you want, either war until the end, and in this case we will not wait behind the walls until we die of hunger and thirst. But we will kill the prisoners of war. Your people number more than 30,000, then we kill our women and children with our own hands and attack your army with 300,000 fighters, none of whom are anything but haters of life and thirsty for revenge. The man was silent until he collected his breath, then he continued, saying, "Or you return to us Princess Amun-Reeds and the captives from our people, and secure our lives, our money, and our goods, so we return your men to you, evacuate Huaris, and turn our faces towards the desert from which we came, leaving your country to you as you wish." Thus ends the conflict that lasted 2 centuries. The man was silent, so the king knew that he was waiting for his answer, but the answer was not present or something that would help with intuition, so he said to the messenger, "Will you wait until we decide on an opinion?" The messenger said, "As you wish, O king, my lord has given me a day today." 28. The king met with his men in the cabin of the pharaonic ship and said to them, "Advise me of your opinion." And they were all of an opinion without consultation or agreement. So Ha said, "My lord, you have defeated the shepherds in many locations and they acknowledged victory to you and to themselves defeat. Thus, you erased the traces of the defeats that afflicted us in our sad past, and you killed many of them, and you took revenge for the slain of your miserable people, so do not blame us now. To buy the lives of 30,000 of our men, and to spare ourselves an unnecessary sacrifice of souls, as long as our enemy will withdraw from our country defeated, and our homeland will be liberated forever." The king turned his eyes to the faces of his people and found unanimous enthusiasm among them to accept the idea. Commander Thebes said, "Every one of our soldiers has fully performed his duty, and the return of Apophis to the desert is more detrimental than the taste of death." Commander Moab said, "Our ultimate goal is to liberate the country from the rule of shepherds and evacuate them from its lands. The Lord has made this easy for us, so it is not permissible for us to prolong the era of humiliation by choice." Ahmose our father said, "We are buying the lives of 30,000 prisoners with the captive princess and a group of shepherds." The king listened to his men with great interest and said, "Yes, the opinion is good, but I think that the messenger of Apophis should wait another period so that he does not think that we hasten to agree with him on the peaceful opinion due to weakness or boredom of the struggle." The men left the ship and the king was alone, and although he had reasons to rejoice, he was gloomy and distressed. His struggle had been crowned with clear victory, and his mighty enemy knelt before him. From the next day, Apophis would carry his belongings and flee to the desert from which his people had come, submitting to the will of the unstoppable judiciary, so why not? Is he happy or not happy? Or is it that his joy is not pure and his joy is not complete? The dangerous hour had arrived, the hour of farewell forever. Before that dangerous hour, he had been truly desperate, but she was there in the small ship. What would he do tomorrow if he returned to the palace of Thebes and she was carried to the belly of the unknown desert? Should he let her go without giving her a farewell look? And his heart answered no. He broke the shackles of arrogance and pride, stood up, left the cabin, and took a boat to the captive princess's ship, saying to himself, "No matter how she receives it, I will find something to say." And he boarded the ship and went to the room, and the guards greeted him and opened for him. He passed through the door with a heart pounding, and took a look at the room. The simple little boy saw the captive sitting in the chest on a desk. Apparently she was not expecting his return, so her beautiful face showed astonishment and denial. Ahmose examined her with a deep look and found her as beautiful as he had ever seen her, and he saw her features as the day she was engraved in his heart on the deck of the pharaonic ship. So he bit his lip and said to her, "Have a good morning, O princess." She looked up at him with eyes that did not show any amazement, as if she did not know what to answer. The king did not wait long, so he said in a calm voice and in a tone that did not indicate anything, "From today on, you are free, princess." He said in her face that she did not understand anything, so he said again, "Don't you hear what I'm saying? From this moment on, you are free. Your captivity has ended, princess, and freedom has become your right." Her astonishment increased, and hope appeared in her eyes. She said eagerly, "Is what you say true? Is what you say true?" "What I say is true." Her face lit up and her cheeks became flushed, then she hesitated for a moment and asked, "But how was that?" "Oh, I read in your eyes your ambitious hopes. Do you not wish that your father's victory was the one that restored your freedom to you? I am reading this, but it was his defeat, alas, that ended your slavery. She calmed her tongue and did not say a word, so he told her briefly about what her father's messenger had proposed to him and what had been agreed upon. Then he said, "In a little while, you will be carried to your father and you will travel with him to wherever he goes, so bless you this day." A shadow of sadness covered her face, her expression froze, and she lowered her gaze. Ahmose asked her, "Do you find your sadness at defeat greater than your joy at your freedom?" She said, "You should not gloat over me, for we will leave your country with dignity as we lived in it with dignity." Ahmose said with apparent alarm, "I am not gloating over you, princess, for we have tasted the bitterness of defeat before and long wars have taught us to bear witness to your courage and valor." She said with satisfaction, "Thank you, king." He heard her speak for the first time in a tone devoid of anger and pride, so he was moved and said to her with a sad smile, "I see you calling me king, princess." She said, lowering her gaze, "Because you are the king of this valley without a partner, but I will not be called a princess from now on." The king was even more affected, and he did not expect her to soften in this way. He thought she was becoming more arrogant with defeat, so he said sadly, "O princess, the memories of this world are a record of pleasure and pain, and you have experienced life, both sweet and bitter, and there is still a tomorrow ahead of you." She said with amazing reassurance, "Yes, we have a tomorrow ahead of us behind the mirage of the unknown desert, and we will meet our fate valiantly." Silence prevailed, and their eyes met, and he read serenity and tenderness in her eyes. So he mentioned the owner of the cabin who saved his life from death and made him drink the nectar of affection and tenderness, as if he was seeing her for the first time after that long era, so his heart shook and he said with seriousness and alarm, "In a little while, we will be separated, and you will not care about that, but I will always remember that you were rude and rude to me." Sadness appeared in her eyes, and her lips faded into a slight smile, and she said, "O king, you know very little about us. We are the people of death, and I relieve their souls of humiliation. I never wanted you to be humiliated. But I was tempted by hope as a sign of the status I thought I had with you." She said in a faint voice, "Isn't it a humiliation to open my arms to my captor and my father's enemy?" He said bitterly, "Love does not know this logic." So she remained silent, as if she trusted his words, so she murmured in a low voice that he did not hear, "I blame no one but myself," and her eyes rang with a lost tone, and with a sudden movement. She reached her hand to the pillow of her bed and took out from under it the necklace with the emerald heart and placed it around her neck calmly and submissively, and he followed her with unbelievable eyes. Then he threw himself uncontrollably beside her, and wrapped his arm around her neck and hugged her to his chest madly and violently. She did not resist him at all, but said sadly, "Beware, it is too late." He tightened his arms around her and said in a shaking voice, "Ammon reads. How is it easy for you to say this? Rather, how can I not discover my happiness until it is about to disappear? No, I will not let you go." She ran to him with compassion and said to him, "What are you doing? I will keep you by my side. Don't you know what my staying by your side requires? Will you spare 30,000 prisoners from your people and many times more from your soldiers for my sake?" His face frowned, his eyes darkened, and he muttered, as if he were talking to himself, "My father and grandfather were martyred for the sake of my people, and I gave them my life. Do they think of my heart as being happy?" She shook her head sadly and said gently, "Listen to me, Thebans, and let me call you by this dear name, because it is the first name I love in my world. There is no need to separate. We will separate. We will separate. You are not satisfied with the goodness of 30,000 prisoners from your people whom you love, and neither am I. I accept the killing of my father and my people. Let each of us bear our share of pain." He looked at her with astonishment, as if he refused to let his full share of love be satisfied with separation and enduring the pain, and said to her with hope, "Amenradides, do not be hasty in despair and feel sorry for the mention of separation, for running it on your tongue so easily sends madness into my blood. Amenradides, let me knock on all doors. To your father's door. What would happen if I asked for your hand?" She smiled sadly and said, gently touching his hand, "Alas, Thebans, you do not understand what you are saying. Do you think my father would agree to marry his daughter to the victorious king who oppressed him and had him exiled from the country in which he was born and whose throne he sat on? I know my father better than you, so there is no benefit to be expected, and there is no way but patience." He listened to her in amazement and was wondering, is it true that the one speaking in this low, broken, sad voice is Princess Amenrides, whose madness, recklessness, and arrogance the world could not contain? A person has the right to separate himself from the one he loves. You are a king, my lord, and kings are the people who have the greatest enjoyment and the heaviest duty. Like a tall tree, it is more deserving of the sun's rays and breezes than the weeds, and is more exposed to the turbulence of the wind and uprooting by the whirlwinds. Then he became excited, saying, "Oh, how miserable I am! I have loved you since the first meeting on my ship." So she lowered her eyes and said simply and sincerely, "Love touched my heart on that same day, but I did not discover it until later, and my emotions were awakened the night Commander Rock forced you to duel him, and my compassion guided me to my illness, and I spent the night confused, not knowing what to do with this new baby. Until magic overwhelmed me. A few days later, I lost consciousness. In the cabin. Is not it? Yes. Oh, what would my life be like without you? My life would be like without you, Esphines." So he hugged her to his chest and pressed his cheek to hers as if he thought that their closeness would make them despair of the specter of separation that lay before them. It was too great for him to discover his love and bid him a final farewell in 1 hour. He pursued every path of thought seeking a solution, but despair and oppression came upon him, and the goal of his effort was to tighten his arms around her, and he felt both of them thought it was time for them to separate, but neither of them moved a muscle, so they remained as one thing. 29. Ahmose left the princess's ship, his feet barely carrying him. He was looking at something in his palm and muttered, saying, "Is this all that is left of my love?" And the emerald necklace was the chain of his love that was left to him. The princess gave it to him as a keepsake and kept the heart for herself, and the king rode. He hastened and went to his army camp, and he was met by his men, headed by the guard Hoa, and he was stealing worried and pitying looks from his master. The king went to the pavilion and called for the messenger of Apophis and said to him, "O messenger, we have carefully studied what you presented to us, and since my goal was to liberate my country from your control, which is what you accepted. With it, I have chosen a peaceful solution to spare the blood, and we will exchange the prisoners immediately, but I will not order you to stop working until the last man among you leaves Hors, thus turning this black page in the history of my country." The messenger bowed his head and said, "What you have seen is good, O king, for if war is not an end that requires it, it becomes killing and slaughter." Ahmose said, "Now I will leave you to discuss together the details of the exchange and evacuation." The king rose and everyone stood up and bowed to him in reverence. He greeted them with his hand and left the place. 30. On the evening of that day, prisoners were exchanged. Then one of the doors of Horus opened, and groups of prisoners, women and men, emerged from it. They were happily cheering for their king and waving their hands. The shepherd prisoners, led by Princess Amenrides, went to the city in silence and solemnity. On the morning of the second day, Ahmose and his entourage rose early to a nearby plateau overlooking the gates of Horus to witness the departure of the shepherds from the last Egyptian city. They did not hide their joy, and their faces shone with the light of joy and rejoicing. The leader, Moheb, was saying, "In a little while, the guards of Apophis will come with the keys of Horus to hand them over to His Majesty the King." The keys of Thebes were also handed over to Apophis 11 years ago. The chamberlains came as Commander Moheb said, and presented to Ahmose an ebony box in which were stacked the keys of Horus. The king received it and gave him his chief chamberlain, and returned the greeting of the men who had returned from whence they came in stillness and silence. Then the eastern gates opened, and their creaking echoed throughout the sides of the valley, and the people of the plateau looked up silently, and the first group of people to leave appeared. They were heavily armed knights brought by Apophis to explore the unknown road, followed by groups of women and children riding on the backs of mules and donkeys, some of them being carried in howitzers. It took hours for them to leave. For a long time, then a great carriage appeared, surrounded by horsemen of the guard, followed by many carts drawn by bulls, and those who saw it knew that it was Apophis and his family, and Ahmose's heart throbbed at the sight of him and fought back a tear of heat that he felt being pulled from his bosoms, and he wondered, what place is she in? Do you find the same way in searching for him as he does in searching for her? Does she remind him the same way he reminds her? Does she hold back her tears the way he holds back his? He continued riding with his eyes, not paying attention to the soldiers streaming in his wake from all doors, and he continued to follow them with his sight and heart and hover around them with his spirit until the horizon disappeared and the unseen swallowed them up. The king woke up to the voice of Hor, saying, "In this immortal hour, the soul of our king Sykanre and our glorious hero Ahmose will be happy, and the struggle of Thebes, which knows no despair, will be crowned with clear victory." The Salvation Army entered the mighty Hyksos and occupied its impregnable walls, and stayed there until dawn. Ahmose marched eastward with his chariot squad, led by his vanguards. He entered Tinis and buried me. There the springs came to him and congratulated him on the evacuation of the last man of the shepherds from the land of Egypt. So the king returned to Hyksos and ordered that the army pray a comprehensive prayer. For the Lord Amon, the various squads were organized, with each squad having its officers and commander at the head, and at the head of all the king and his entourage. Then they all knelt down in reverence and offered a fervent prayer to the Lord. Ahmose concluded his prayer by praying to his Lord, saying, "I praise and thank you, O Lord who is worshipped, for you have reached my wings and strengthened my heart, and have honored me by achieving the goal for which my grandfather and father were martyred. O God, inspire me with what is right and support me with determination and security to bandage the wounds of my people, and make them the best worshipper of the best worshipped." Then Ahmose called his men to meet him, and they quickly responded. He said to them, "Today the war ends, so we must sheath our swords, but the struggle is never over, and believe me, peace is greater than war, in need of awakening souls and strengthening resolves, so lend me your hearts so that we may send Egypt a new mission." The king looked at the faces of his men for a while, then continued, "I decided to begin the struggle for peace by choosing my loyal assistants. Therefore, I entrust her with the ministry." Ha rose to his master, knelt before him, and kissed his hand. The king said, "I see that Seneb is a good successor to her in my palace, but Dib is the head of the pharaonic guard." The king looked at Moheb and said, "And you, Moheb, are the general commander of my army." Then he turned to Ahmose our father and said, "As for you, you are the commander of the fleet, and the loss of your father, the valiant commander Pipi, will be returned to you." The king directed his words to everyone, saying, "Now return to Thebes, the capital of our king, so that everyone can perform his duty." Hor worriedly asked, "Will Pharaoh not return to Thebes at the head of his army?" Ahmose said as he stood up, "Rather, my ship will take me off to Deba to bring the good news of victory to my family, then I will return with it to Thebes, so that we can all enter it as we all left it." 31. The pharaonic ship took off, escorted by 3 warships, and Ahmose was staying in the cabin, looking at the distant horizon with a fixed face and eyes full of sadness and grief. The journey took days, then the small Deba appeared with its scattered huts, and the fleet anchored on its shore in the afternoon, and the king and his guards left it in their beautiful clothes, and their attracted attention was drawn, and a group of Nubians rushed to them, and they walked in front of them to the house of the ruler, Rom. And it spread throughout the city that a major pharaonic messenger had come to visit the family of Sykanre, and the news preceded the king to the ruler's house. When he approached, he saw the ruler and the pharaonic family in the courtyard of the palace waiting, and the king appeared on them, so the meeting took place. Their tongues were filled with astonishment and joy, and Rom knelt down, and everyone shouted a cry of joy and happiness and rushed to him, and the first of them was the young queen Nefertari. So he kissed her cheeks and forehead and looked and saw his mother, Queen Stychmus, with her arms extended, so he hugged her to his chest and gave her his cheeks to kiss them tenderly, and his grandmother, Queen Ahatepei, was waiting for her turn. He approached her and kissed her hands and her forehead, and finally he saw Totishuri, the last and dearest of the people, Totishuri, who was crowned with grey hair and her old cheeks had faded, So his heart skipped a beat and he surrounded her with his arms as he said, "His mother and the mother of all." She kissed him with her thin lips and said, raising her eyes to him, "Let me look at the image of Siknir the serpent." Ahmose said, "I chose, mother, to be the messenger who gives you good news of the great victory, so know, mother, that our valiant army achieved clear victory, defeated Apophis and his people, expelled them to the desert from which they came, and liberated all of Egypt from their slavery, so the promise of Amun was fulfilled. And the souls of Siknir and Camus were happy." Tutushiri's face beamed, and her bright eyes flashed with joy, and she said with joy, "Today our captivity will be released and we will return to Thebes, and I find it, as I used to, a city of glory and sovereignty, and I find my grandson on the throne of Siknir, continuing what was interrupted from Amenemhet's glorious life." The queen's maid, Mrs. Ray, came carrying the crown prince in her arms. She bowed to the king and said, "My lord, kiss your little child and your crown prince Amenhotep." The look in his eyes softened and his cheeks filled with tenderness, and he took the little boy in his arms and brought him closer to his mouth until his longing lips were attached to him, and Amenhotep smiled at his father and played with him with his little hands. Then the pharaonic family entered the house filled with happiness and tranquility, and they found themselves chatting and reminiscing about their days. 32. The soldiers carried the family's belongings to the pharaonic ship, then the king and his family moved to it, and Governor Raum, the members of his government, and all the people of Deba went out to bid them farewell. Before the ship lifted its anchors, Ahmose called Raum and said to him, in the hearing of his men, "O faithful ruler, I advise you to do well for Nubia and the people of Nubia. Nubia was our refuge when the world was narrow for us, and our homeland when we had no homeland. And we protect from it what we hate for it." Then the ship took off, and the guard ships took off behind it, making their way towards the north, carrying people eager to return to Egypt and its people. The ship reached the borders of Egypt after a short journey, and was received with a wonderful reception. The men of the south went out to it in Governor Shaw's ship, and the boats of the people surrounded it, chanting and singing, and he boarded the ship. On its deck was Shaw, the priests of Baja, Balak, and saying, the mayors of the villages, and the sheikhs of the country, so they prostrated themselves before the king and listened to his advice. Then the ship descended toward the north, and the people would meet it on the shores, and boats would circumnavigate it, and the rulers, judges, mayors, and notables would ascend to its deck at each town. The ship continued to move on until the darkness of dawn dissipated. Morning on the horizon, far from the high walls of Thebes, its huge doors, and its eternal majesty, and the family rushed from the cabins to the bow of the ship, fixing their eyes on the horizon, and nostalgia and devotion were evident in their looks, and their eyes overflowed with tears of gratitude, and their lips murmured in a low voice, "Thebes, Thebes," and the queen said, "Ahotep," in a shaking voice, "Oh my God! I never imagined that I would set my sight on these walls again." The ship approached the south of Thebes with a favorable wind until they were able to see crowds of soldiers and senior people on the shore waiting. Ahmose knew that Thebes was paying its first respects to its savior, so he returned to the cabin followed by his family and sat on the throne, and they sat around it. The soldiers gave the military salute to the pharaonic ship, and he boarded. To its surface are good men, at their head were the Prime Minister Hor, the two commanders Moheb and Ahmose, the head of the pharaonic guard, Deb, the chief chamberlain, Seneb, and the ruler of Thebes, Tutankhamun, then an old priest with burnt grey hair. Leaning on his scepter and walking at a slow pace, stooping, and the men all prostrated themselves before Pharaoh, and Hor said to him, "My lord, the liberator of Egypt, the savior of Thebes, the conqueror of the shepherds, the Pharaoh of Egypt and the lord of the south and the north. All of Thebes is in the markets eagerly waiting for the presenter of Ahmose, son of Ahmose, son of Siknari, and his glorious family, to extend to them all the warmest greetings and greetings she has gathered upon her heart." Ahmose smiled and said, "May the Lord bless you, O sincere men, and may the glorious Thebes live, my principle and my goal." Hor gestured to the venerable priest and said, "My lord, allow me to present to your majesty Nufu-Amun, the high priest of the temple of Amun." Ahmose looked at him with interest, extended his hand to him with a smile, and said gently, I am pleased to see you, high priest." So the priest clasped his hand and said, "My lord, the Pharaoh of Egypt and the son of Amun, the renewer of the life of Egypt and the reviver of the lives of its greatest kings. I, my lord, had vowed to myself that I would not leave my room as long as there was in Egypt a man of the shameful shepherds who humiliated Thebes and killed its glorious lord, and I neglected myself, and the hair on my head grew thick. And my body, and I was satisfied with the world with morsels to survive and sips of boiling water so that I could share with our people the filth and hunger they were afflicted with, and I continued until God assigned his son Ahmose to Egypt. So he carried out an honest campaign against our enemy and tore his body apart and expelled him from our country. So I pardoned myself and was released, to receive the king. Glorious, and I pray for him." So the king smiled at him, and the priest asked permission to greet the family, and he gave him permission, so he went to Tutashiri and greeted her, and then went to Queen Ahmose, who was one of her close associates during the reign of Seqenre. Then he kissed Sechemos and Nefertari. Then Hor said to his master, "My lord, Thebes is waiting for its master, and the army is lined up on the roads, but the high priest of Amun has hope." Ahmose asked, "What is the hope of our high priest?" The priest said respectfully, "My lord, please visit the temple of Amun before he goes to the pharaonic palace." Ahmose said, smiling, what hope he has in achieving sheep and happiness. 33. Ahmose left the ship, followed by the queens and men of his kingdom. He was met by officers and soldiers who had fought with him since the first day. The king returned their greetings and ascended to a beautiful pharaonic hood. The queens mounted their hoods, and the hoods were raised and led by a squad of the royal guard. The wheels of the entourage moved behind them, followed by another squad of the royal guard. The royal procession advanced towards the central southern gate of Thebes, and it was decorated with flags and flowers, lined on both sides by the tough soldiers who had stormed in the recent past. The pharaonic howitzers passed the gate of the city between two rows of sharp spears, and the trumpets were blown by the guards of the walls, and flowers and winds fell on those entering. Ahmose looked around him and saw a wondrous sight that astonishes sober souls. He saw all the people of Egypt in one look. He saw bodies blocking the paths, walls, and houses. Rather, he saw spirits pure of worship, love, and enthusiasm. The atmosphere was filled with cheers rising from the hearts, and people were mesmerized by the vision of the Holy Mother in the majesty of old age and the majesty of old age, and her valiant grandson in the brilliance of strength and youth. Amun in hours. At the door of the temple, the king and his family received the priests of Amun, and they prayed for him for a long time and walked before him to the hall of the columns, where sacrifices were presented on the altar, and the priests sang the hymn of the Lord in melodious, sweet voices that remained echoed in the hearts for a long time. Then the high priest said to the king, "My lord, permit me to go to the Holy of Holies to bring valuables of interest to your majesty." So the king gave him permission, and the man went away with a group of priests, and they were absent for a short time. Then the priest appeared again, followed by the priests carrying a coffin, a throne, and a box of gold. They placed them all in front of the pharaonic family with respect and reverence. Nufaman advanced until he stood in front of Ahmose, and said in a charming, penetrating voice, "My lord, what I am presenting to your attention are the most precious relics of the Holy Kingdom, which were entrusted to me for 12 years by the valiant and immortal leader Bibi, to be safe from the hand of the greedy enemy reaching it. As for the coffin, it is the coffin of the martyr King Seqenre, preserving his mummified body, whose shrouds contained severe wounds, each of which recorded an immortal page of valor and sacrifice. As for the throne, it is his glorious throne, which fulfilled his right and proclaimed the word of goodness and honor over it, who preferred to be afflicted with the horrors of struggle rather than remain calm and achieve the humiliation of safety. As for this golden box, it contains the double crown of Egypt, the crown of Timaeus, the last of our kings who ruled a united Egypt. I gave it to Seqenre while he was going to fight Apophis, so he fought the battle with his honorable head on, and he was defended by the defense that all the people of the valley know. This, my lord, is the deposits of Bibi. Holy, I thank the Lord for extending my life until I returned it to its owners. May it last for glory and may glory be theirs." Everyone's eyes turned to the pharaonic coffin, then they all prostrated, led by the pharaonic family, and prayed in humility. The king and his family approached the coffin and surrounded it. They were all silent, but the coffin spoke to their hearts and secrets. For the first time, Tutishiri felt helpless, so she leaned on the king's arm, her tears concealing the beloved coffin from her view. Ha was determined to quench the tears of the Holy Mother and soothe the pain of her heart, so he said, "Let us provide Amun, O High Priest, keep this coffin in the Holy of Holies until it is deposited in its tomb with a solemn ceremony befitting the status of its owner." So the priest asked permission from his master and ordered his men to lift the coffin to the resting place of the worshipped Lord. The priest opened the box and extracted from it the double crown of Egypt. He approached Ahmose in reverence and crowned his curly head with it. The people saw what the priest had done and they all chanted, "Long live the Pharaoh of Egypt." Nufa Amun called the king and the queens to visit the holy resting place, so they all walked, with Tutishiri still leaning on the arm of Ahmose, and they crossed the sacred threshold that separates this world from the hereafter, and they prostrated to the Holy Lord and closed the curtains drawn over his statue. And they prayed a prayer of thanks and praise that he had granted them victory and returned them to their homeland. Victorious. The king and the queens left for Hodja, and the throne was carried on a large carriage. The procession resumed its journey to the palace, among the crowds shouting and calling out, cheering and waving branches strewn with flowers. They reached the old palace at noon, and Tutishiri was greatly affected, so her heart palpitations increased and she was disturbed. She was out of breath, so she was carried in her howdah to her royal suite, and the queens and the king followed her, and they sat before her anxiously, but she regained her calm and returned with the strength of her will and faith, so she sat up and looked at the beloved faces with tenderness and said in a weak voice, "Excuse me, my children. My heart has betrayed me for the first time, and to a great extent. This heart has endured so much patience, so let me kiss you all, for at my age it is quick to reach hope in the end." 34. Evening came and the night fell, and Thebes had no way to sleep, so they stayed awake with torches waving in their streets and suburbs, and people gathered in their squares to sing and chant, and their homes were filled with songs and melodies. That night, Ahmose did not sleep despite his fatigue and distress, and the bed became aware of him, so he went out to the balcony overlooking the palace's splendid garden. He sat on a comfortable sofa in the light of a dim lamp, and his soul wandered in the overwhelming darkness. His fingertips played with a gold chain with tenderness and pity, looking at it from time to time as if he was deriving his thoughts and dreams from it. The young queen, Nefertari, joined him unexpectedly, and her joy was clear of sadness. She thought that her husband was as happy as she was, so she sat next to him, happy and cheerful. The king turned to her, smiling, and she saw the chain in his hand. She took it in astonishment and said, "Is this a necklace? How beautiful it is! But he is amputated." He said while gathering his thoughts, "Yes, he lost his heart." "Alas, where was he lost?" He said, "I don't know, except that it was lost against my will." So I looked at him affectionately and asked him, "Did you intend to give him to me?" He said, "I am saving for you what is more valuable and more beautiful than this." She said, "How do you feel sorry for him then?" He said, trying to make his voice sound natural and calm, "It reminds me of the first days of struggle, when I went out seeking Thebes, disguised in the clothes of merchants, calling myself a sphinx, while I was offering them to people for purchase. What a beautiful memory. Nefertari, I would like you to call me a sphinx, as it is a name I love." He loved his covenant and loved those who loved him. The king turned his face to hide the emotion and nostalgia that appeared on it, so the queen smiled happily, and she looked forward and saw in the distance the light of a torch moving slowly, and she said, pointing with her hand, "Look at this torch." Ahmose cast his gaze to where it was pointing, then said, "This is a torch in a boat swimming close to the garden." It is as if the owner of the boat deliberately approached the palace garden so that the arriving people could hear the beauty of his voice, and he greeted them alone after Thebes had greeted them all, So he raised his boat singing in the stillness of the night, his rhyme being echoed by a flute. I've been lying in my room for years. I suffer from the pain of a sickness and hunger. Then my family and neighbors visited me. I was visited by fortune tellers and doctors. My doctors and neighbors were exhausted by the disease. Until you came, my love. Your magic excelled at medicine and sophistication. Because you know the secret of my illness. His voice was beautiful and listening, so Ahmose and Nefertari listened, and the queen was looking at the light of the torch with compassion and tenderness, and the king was looking at what was between his feet with half-closed eyes, memories wailing in his heart.